My son-in-law dropped me at the hospital entrance and promised to be back in an hour. He never came back. 4 hours in a hard plastic chair, 6 unanswered calls. Just silence. He thought I was just a quiet, retired old man with a record collection. He had no idea I owned the building where he worked. And that patience, real patience, is the sharpest weapon there is. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Walter Harrison. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in Knoxville, Tennessee for most of my adult life. Long enough to know which streets flood after a hard rain and which coffee shops close early on Sundays. For 31 years, I worked as an archivist for the city's municipal records office. Not exactly the kind of job that gets you invited to cocktail parties, but I learned something in that building that most people never bother to learn. Information is patient. It sits in a folder, in a drawer, in a database, and it waits. Sometimes it waits for years. And when the right moment comes, it is still there, precise and unchanged, while everyone around it has forgotten it ever existed. I'm a quiet man, always have been. I collect vinyl records, mostly 1950s and 60s jazz and standards, the kind of music that sounds like it knows something you don't. On Thursday evenings, I play chess at a club downtown on Gay Street, a windowless little room that smells like old coffee and someone's grandfather. I'm not the best player there, but I'm patient. That counts for more than people realize. I live at 1247 Ridgecrest Lane, in a house I bought in 1989. 3 bedrooms, a screened back porch, a detached garage where I keep my record collection and climate-controlled shelving. It's a good house. I've put work into it over the years, and it shows. For the past 3 years, I have not lived alone in that house. My daughter Laura moved in with her husband Craig Patterson about 34 months ago. The reason, as they explained it, was practical. Craig was between positions. They were saving for a down payment on their own place, and it would only be temporary. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. She was 33 at the time, and she had that particular way of asking for things. Soft voice, direct eyes, that reminded me of when she was 9 years old and wanted a dog. I always found it difficult to say no to that face. I want to be fair about Laura. She wasn't always the person I'm going to describe. When she was growing up, she was thoughtful, curious. She used to sit in my home office while I worked on personal archiving projects and ask me questions about the records I was organizing, about the history behind the names and dates and documents. We had that in common, a genuine interest in how things connected, how the past explained the present. I thought it would always be there between us, that thread. Then she married Craig Patterson. I don't say that to be reductive. I understand that people change, that relationships reshape people in ways that are hard to untangle afterward. But the transformation in Laura was not subtle. It happened gradually over the first year of their marriage and then accelerated, as if she had finally committed to a direction and stopped second-guessing it. The woman who moved into my house 3 years ago looked like my daughter and used her voice, but the way she calculated things, the way her eyes moved across a room, that was Craig's influence, plain and clear. Craig Patterson is 38 years old. He is tall, well-dressed, and has the kind of easy confidence that comes not from competence, but from never having been seriously held accountable for anything. He works as a mid-level manager at a company called Ridgeline Commercial Partners, which leases office space in a building on Summit Hill Drive. He drives a leased BMW. He uses words like leverage and optics in casual conversation without apparent irony. In 3 years of living under my roof, he has never once asked me a question about my life before retirement that wasn't related to money. I notice things. That's what archivists do. We notice and we file. The way Craig would glance at the framed property documents in my hallway when he thought I wasn't watching. The conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. The time Laura casually mentioned, as if reading from a script, that a financial advisor Craig knew had some interesting thoughts about estate planning and tax efficiency. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I watched, and I waited. The morning in early April started like most mornings at Ridgecrest Lane. I came downstairs to find Craig already dressed for work, standing at the kitchen counter with his phone, scrolling through something with the focused expression of a man who has important things happening. Laura was making coffee. There was a routine to all of this, the small performances of domestic normalcy that we had all agreed, without ever discussing it, to maintain. Craig had offered the night before to drive me to my appointment at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. Routine cardiology follow-up, nothing urgent. My own car was at the shop. The alternator, a $200 problem I'd already arranged to have fixed by Thursday. Craig's offer seemed generous. I accepted it. He pulled up to the main entrance at 8:40 in the morning. The engine stayed running. He handed me his cell number written on a gas station receipt, which I thought was an odd detail. He knew I had his number, and said with the comfortable certainty of a man making a promise he has no intention of keeping, "I'll be back in about an hour. Just text me when you're wrapping up." The appointment took 40 minutes. I sat in the waiting area afterward with my phone in my hand. 1 hour passed. I sent a text. No response. 90 minutes. I called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 2 hours. I called Laura. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear in the background the particular ambient noise of a shopping center, the low hum of climate control, the distant echo of a store. "Dad," she said, with that specific blend of mild concern and mild irritation that I had come to recognize as her default register when I inconvenienced a plan she hadn't told me about. "He's just stuck in something for work. He'll be there soon." He was not there soon. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. The chairs were hard plastic, the pale orange color of a discontinued home appliance. A television mounted near the ceiling was playing a cable news channel, with the volume too low to follow. I watched the parking lot through the window. I watched other people get picked up, by spouses, by adult children, by car services. I called Craig twice more. I called Laura once more. The calls went unanswered or produced variations of soon. At 12:40 in the afternoon, I walked to the front desk and asked them to call a cab. In the taxi heading back toward Ridgecrest Lane, I watched the East Tennessee hills rolling past the window, and I did something I hadn't done in a while. I stopped thinking about the offense. I stopped cataloging the small humiliations, the 4 plastic chairs, the unanswered calls, the quiet dismissal in Laura's voice. Those feelings were real, and they were mine, but they weren't useful. Not in that moment. Instead, I started thinking about numbers, specific numbers, the kind that live in folders in a safe in my bedroom closet, patient and unchanged, waiting for the right moment. Craig apologized the next morning. I'll give him this. He was good at it. Not in a groveling, excessive way that might have actually cost him something. He did it the way a man apologizes when he's confident the apology will be accepted. Smoothly, briefly, with just enough self-deprecation to seem genuine. Something had come up at work, he said. A client's situation. He'd meant to call, but the morning had gotten away from him. You know how it is. His expression carried the faint suggestion that I, of all people, should understand the demands of professional life. "No trouble at all, Craig," I said. I set down my coffee cup. "I already handled it." He nodded, smiled, went back to his phone. He took it as forgiveness. I watched him do it, watched the way he filed the whole episode away under resolved and moved on, and I felt something clarify inside me, the way a chess position clarifies when you've finally identified the correct line of play 3 moves out. That evening, after Craig had left for what he called a work dinner, and Laura had retreated to the living room with her television program, I went to my bedroom and closed the door. I opened the closet. Behind the winter coats, behind the archived boxes of tax records and personal documents that had accumulated over 31 years of professional habit, there was a small fireproof safe. I'd had it for 20 years. The combination was the year I bought my first record player, 1971. I took out the property folder. While I was looking at the pages, a specific memory surfaced. I wasn't looking for it. That's how the useful memories arrive, in my experience. They come when you're doing something else. Laura was 14. It was a Saturday in September, warm and golden the way September sometimes is in East Tennessee before the weather turns. We were at a used book sale at the public library, working our way through the tables together. She found a copy of an old Tennessee history that had belonged to someone named E.L. Briggs. The name was stamped inside the cover in faded ink. She spent 10 minutes speculating about who E.L. Briggs had been, what his life had looked like, why this book had ended up on a folding table outside a library decades after his death. She wasn't sad about it. She was just genuinely curious about the story behind the object. That was my daughter. That was who she was. I held the property folder in my lap for a while after that memory passed through me. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment or a single event. It accumulates slowly, the way sediment accumulates, layer by thin layer, over months and years, until one day you realize the landscape has fundamentally changed and you can no longer identify the original ground. Losing a person who is still physically present in your life is like that. It creeps up on you. I remembered a dinner about 18 months after Laura and Craig had moved in, the three of us at the kitchen table. Craig was talking, he was often talking at dinners, about a colleague of his who'd made what Craig considered a strategically poor decision about a property investment. I wasn't tracking the details closely. I was finishing the pot roast I'd made. But then Craig said something about people who sit on assets without understanding how to work them, and I looked up, and Laura was nodding with that careful, calibrated agreement she had developed for Craig's opinions. She caught my eye for a half second and then looked away. That half second, the tiny flicker of something older and quieter in her face before it was replaced by the neutral expression she maintained now, stayed with me. I opened my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in some time. Marshall Ridley. He's an attorney who handles real estate and trust matters, a careful, methodical man who keeps his opinions to himself and is filing in impeccable order. We'd worked together on property transactions over the years, nothing more than that. I called his office line, knowing he'd be gone for the evening, and left a message asking him to call me back the next morning. I kept it brief. I didn't explain what I needed. With Marshall, you didn't have to front-load explanations. He called back and asked the right questions. He called back the next morning at 8:45. "Marshall," I said, "I need a full legal audit of every active lease in the Summit Hill Drive property, particularly the Ridgeline Commercial Partners Agreement, terms, clauses, notice requirements, everything." There was a brief pause. "Any particular reason or just housekeeping?" "Housekeeping," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll have it to you within the week." That was the entire conversation. I appreciated that about Marshall Ridley. He asked one clarifying question, got a sufficient answer, and proceeded. No elaborating, no speculating, no unsolicited observations about what I might be doing or why. A professional courtesy I'd long found underrated. I put the phone down and sat quietly for a moment. From somewhere downstairs I could hear the television, Laura laughing at something, the comfortable sounds of two people living in a house that wasn't theirs. I thought about Craig's easy smile that morning, about the gas station receipt, about 4 plastic chairs in a waiting room. I got up, went to the shelf on the far wall, and looked through the records. I pulled out a Cole Porter collection, a 1957 pressing light surface wear, otherwise clean. I set the needle down. The music filled the room, unhurried and precise, and for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, something shifted in my chest. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter and more purposeful than either of those. I was 68 years old. I had spent 31 years learning that information is patient, that documents tell truths that people have long since forgotten or never known, and that the right piece of paper, filed in the right place, reviewed at the right time, has a weight that no amount of charm or smooth apology can balance out. Craig Patterson had dropped me at a hospital entrance and driven away. He had no idea what was parked in the folders I kept in that safe. I let the music play and sat down at my desk. I took out a notepad, a habit from the archive years, always a notepad, and wrote a single line at the top of the page. Then I started working. Marshall Ridley's email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after our phone call. No preamble, no pleasantries. Just a PDF attachment and a single line of text. Lease documentation as requested. Call if you have questions. I appreciated that about him. He treated information the way I always believed it deserved to be treated. as a thing of value, to be delivered intact and without decoration. I printed the lease at my desk, poured a cup of coffee, and read it the way I used to read historical property records back at the municipal archive, slowly, with a pencil, marking the sections that required a second pass. The document ran to 41 pages. Most of it was standard commercial boilerplate, maintenance obligations, insurance requirements, subletting restrictions, the usual scaffolding of a mid-tier office lease in a mid-sized Tennessee city. But I wasn't reading for the standard sections. I found what I was looking for on page 27, section 14, subsection B. It read, in the precise and slightly airless language that attorneys favor, landlord reserves the right to initiate a compliance review if there is reasonable cause to believe that tenant's business conduct has materially compromised the professional reputation of the leased premises. Below that, a note specifying the notice requirements and the timeline for such a review. 14 days written notice, standard certified mail. I set the pencil down and looked at that clause for a while. Craig Patterson worked on the 4th floor of 840 Summit Hill Drive. He had worked there for 2 years and 7 months. He came home every evening talking about his company, his colleagues, his upward trajectory, his contacts, his career. He talked about it the way people talk about things they believe are permanent, with the comfortable assumption that the landscape will remain exactly as it is, for as long as they need it. He had never once, in 2 years and 7 months, asked me what I owned. I found that remarkable, honestly, even from a purely self-interested standpoint, which was the only standpoint Craig seemed to operate from. It was a strange omission. If I had moved in with my father-in-law, I believe the second or third question out of my mouth would have been, "What do you actually own?" Not out of greed, necessarily, just out of basic situational awareness. But Craig had apparently looked at a 68-year-old retired archivist and concluded that the answer wasn't worth finding out. That kind of assumption has a name. I learned it from a professor during a continuing education seminar I attended in 1987, back when the city was updating its records management protocols. He called it status blindness, the tendency to assess people's significance based on visible markers, like job title, age, or manner of dress, while ignoring the information those markers can't show. It's the reason, he said, that important documents sometimes sit in unexamined boxes for decades. Craig had looked at me and seen an unexamined box. I made a note in my small notebook, the green one I kept in the top drawer of my desk, and moved on to the second piece of information I'd been gathering. One of the things I had learned over 3 decades of working with public records was that a surprising amount of significant information exists in accessible form, filed in perfectly ordinary places, simply waiting for someone who knows what to look for and how to look. Corporate employment matters are largely private, of course, but internal promotion announcements, once formalized, sometimes surface in industry newsletters, LinkedIn activity, and local business journals, particularly in a city like Knoxville, where the professional community is tight enough that career moves get noticed. Craig had apparently been circulating the news of his promotion application with more optimism than discretion. A search through the Knoxville Business Journal's online database, which I had accessed through the library's digital subscriptions for the better part of 2 decades, produced a brief mention in a quarterly professional roundup. Craig Patterson, identified as operations manager at Ridgeline Commercial Partners, cited among local professionals pursuing senior leadership opportunities. The item was 3 sentences long, but it confirmed the timeline. A decision was expected within the next few weeks. The position paid $112,000 per year. That was $28,000 more than Craig currently made. I had that figure because Laura, in one of her less careful moments 3 months earlier, had mentioned it while making what I believe she intended as an indirect argument for why they shouldn't have to pay rent at Ridgecrest Lane. "Craig is really close to a big step up," she had said. "It would just make more financial sense to stay stable until that comes through." I hadn't responded to that particular argument. I had simply noted the number. It was a Thursday afternoon when Laura finally made the request directly. She had been building toward it for some time. I could see the structure of the approach, the way you can see the approach of weather, if you know the sky. small comments over dinner, casual references to estate planning and family assets, a story about a neighbor's daughter who had helped her elderly father simplify his portfolio. All of it preliminary, all of it aimed at the same destination. She found me in the back porch, sorting through a box of records I'd pulled from the garage for cleaning. She sat across from me and folded her hands in her lap, in the way she does when she has rehearsed something. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking. With your portfolio the size it is, it would actually make a lot of financial sense to transfer at least one property into a family structure, just for tax efficiency. Craig knows someone who—" "What did you have in mind?" I said. I kept my eyes on the record I was cleaning. Nat King Cole, 1956 pressing, minor scuff on side B. She outlined the idea with the careful casualness of someone who had practiced it. Transfer one property. She didn't specify which one, which I found instructive. Into a jointly held LLC, for tax purposes. Craig's contact would handle the paperwork. It would be completely straightforward. I listened to the whole thing. I set the record down carefully. I looked at her. "Let me think about it," I said. She nodded and went back inside. I picked up my green notebook and wrote down the date, the time, and her exact words, as close to verbatim as I could reconstruct them. Not because I anticipated needing them in a legal context, simply because I had spent 31 years believing that the act of recording something accurately was its own form of respect for the truth. Then I went back to the record. The scuff on side B was superficial. It would clean up fine. That evening I retrieved the bank statement from the envelope where I'd filed it the previous week. I sat at my desk with it for a long time. The balance read $847,000. I took out a fresh sheet of paper, not the green notebook, a clean white sheet, and began writing numbers. Not frantically, not urgently, methodically, the way I had always done things. Column by column, figure by figure. The math, when I finished, was clear and unambiguous. I sat back and looked at what I'd written. Then I folded the sheet in half and put it under the bank statement in the safe. I was beginning to understand the shape of what needed to happen. Marshall Ridley's office is on Gay Street in downtown Knoxville, on the third floor of a building that was constructed in 1931 and has been continuously occupied ever since. The waiting area has dark wood paneling and 2 leather chairs that have been there long enough to acquire a particular kind of dignity. I've always liked the office. It feels like a place where documents are taken seriously. I arrived on a Wednesday morning by appointment, carrying a folder of my own. Marshall is 55, trim, with silver-rimmed glasses and the focused expression of a man who has spent most of his professional life reading things that other people found too boring or too dense to read carefully. We shook hands and sat down. He had the lease documents on his side of the desk, along with a notepad and a pen he hadn't uncapped yet. "What are we doing?" he asked. "2 things," I said. "I want to update the Revocable Living Trust, and I want to restructure the property management through an LLC." He uncapped the pen. "All properties or selected?" "All of them," he made a note. "That's a meaningful restructuring. It'll take time to execute properly." "How long?" "If we move efficiently, 12 days to have the primary documents ready. Another week to 10 days for full execution and filing." "That works," I said. What followed was 2 hours of the kind of conversation I find genuinely satisfying. Detailed, specific, and free of performance. Marshall walked me through the mechanics of updating the trust documentation to reflect current asset values and to ensure that the management LLC, which we were going to call Harrison Property Trust LLC, was properly structured as the titled owner of each property. He explained the key practical implication clearly. Once the restructuring was complete, none of my holdings would appear in any public record under my personal name. They would appear under the LLC. Anyone searching for Walter J. Harrison in the county property registry would find nothing current. The total cost for the full restructuring, $4,200 in legal fees, billed on completion. I wrote him a check for half as a retainer, folded my copy of the notes into my folder, and drove home. The envelope was gone. I noticed it the moment I walked into the bedroom. I keep my financial documents in a specific order in the fireproof safe. tax records on the left, property files in the center, bank statements on the right, each in labeled manila envelopes. I had left that morning with the safe locked. When I came home and opened it to file the notes from Marshall's office, the bank statement envelope was sitting at a slightly different angle than I leave it. The seal, which I always pressed down firmly along the full length, had been re-adhered with visible unevenness along the left corner. Someone had opened it and resealed it, not carefully enough. I stood at the safe for a moment. Then I put the new documents in their place, closed the safe, and went to the kitchen to make a sandwich. Laura was in the living room. Craig wasn't home yet. Neither of them said anything when I came downstairs. Laura was watching television with the careful stillness of someone paying attention to two things at once. That evening, Craig came home from work in an unusually good mood. He poured himself a drink. He had a specific way of doing this when he felt he'd had a successful day, a small, deliberate pour and a slight smile at the glass, and settled into the chair across from me in the living room with the relaxed confidence of a man who believes he has just acquired an advantage. "Walter," he said after a few minutes of television, "I've been meaning to ask, do you have a financial advisor you work with regularly? Someone you trust?" "I manage things directly," I said. "Right, sure, that makes sense for some people." He took a sip. "The thing is, with a portfolio your size, and I don't want to overstep, it might be worth getting a second perspective. I know a guy. He's done some work for a few people at Ridgeline. Very sharp, not a pushy type. He'd just do an initial consultation, no obligation." I looked at him. He held my gaze with the practiced ease of a man who is very good at looking sincere. "I appreciate that, Craig," I said. "I'll keep it in mind." He nodded and went back to the television. I went back to the chess problem I had been working through in my head, a variation on a Sicilian defense position from Thursday's club game that I hadn't fully resolved. I filed Craig's offer in the same mental folder as Laura's property transfer suggestion. Same handwriting. Same filing system. The next morning, while Craig was at work and Laura was out, I drove to a real estate office on Kingston Pike and kept an appointment I had made by phone 2 days earlier. The agent's name was Rebecca Stone. She had been recommended to me by a property manager I'd used several years back. A professional referral, nothing more. Her office was small and organized, with market reports stacked on the credenza and a whiteboard covered in property addresses and price figures. I explained what I needed, a quiet, discreet listing for one of my smaller commercial properties. Not the Summit Hill building, a smaller one, a single-story commercial unit in a mixed-use area south of downtown, currently leased to a dry cleaning operation at $2,100 per month. Market value in current conditions, I estimated, in the range of $310,000. Rebecca pulled up the comparable sales without a word, looked at 3 recent transactions in the neighborhood, and said, "I'd put it at $310 to $320. Market's been flat in that corridor, but steady. If you want a quiet sale, I'd suggest off-market first. I have a short list of buyers looking for exactly this profile. Could have a conversation started within a week." "Off-market is fine," I said. "I'm not in a hurry, but I'd prefer to move before the end of summer." We agreed on terms. I drove home. That evening I sat at my desk and read through everything Marshall had sent over. Draft documents for the LLC formation, the trust amendment language, the schedule of property transfers. It was careful, thorough work. I made 2 small notes in the margins where I wanted adjustments, scanned the pages, and sent them back with a brief reply. The response came before I went to bed. "Revisions noted. Adjusted drafts tomorrow. Documents will be ready to execute within the week." I put the laptop away and looked at the record shelves. I was considering what to put on. I settled on nothing. Sometimes silence is the right choice when you're thinking clearly and don't want to disturb the clarity. I sat in the quiet for a while, running through the logic of what I had set in motion. The trust restructuring would take 12 days. Rebecca Stone would have a buyer conversation started within a week. And somewhere in an office on Summit Hill Drive, Craig Patterson was preparing a promotion application with no idea that the landlord of his building had just spent the afternoon reorganizing everything the building was connected to. I thought about the chess club and a principle that one of the older players there had explained to me once. The most effective preparation is invisible preparation. You don't announce the opening you intend to play. You develop your pieces quietly. Control the center without declaring your intentions, and let your opponent believe the game is still in the opening phase, long after you've already begun the endgame. My phone lit up, a message from Marshall. Documents ready. You can move. I set the phone face down on the desk. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I reached over, opened the desk drawer, and took out the green notebook. I turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. Then I closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and went to bed. Craig Patterson had a meeting with his director in the morning. He didn't know that yet, but I did. The certified letter left Marshall's office on a Wednesday morning. I know this because Marshall sent me a brief confirmation. Notice dispatched via certified mail to Ridgeline Commercial Partners. Attention, David Fletcher, 840 Summit Hill Drive. Delivery expected within 2 business days. I read the message at my desk, set the phone down, and went back to the chess problem I had been working through. A Nimzo Indian position, white to move. The key was patience, waiting for the right square rather than forcing an entry that wasn't there yet. I didn't think about the letter much after that. There was nothing left to think about. It was accurate, it was legal, it was in the mail. Everything I needed to do on my end was done. What happened next was simply going to happen. 3 days passed. Craig came home each evening in his usual rhythm. The leased BMW in the driveway, the loosened tie. The drink poured with that faint, self-satisfied air of a man who still believed the week was going his way. He mentioned his promotion application twice at dinner, both times in the oblique, slightly theatrical way of someone who wants to seem modest about something they're actually quite proud of. He described a conversation with his director as productive. He used the word optics once in reference to something I didn't entirely follow and didn't try to. I listened, I nodded, I passed the salt. I had learned over 31 years in the archive that the most efficient way to manage a large volume of incoming information was to sort it quickly into categories: relevant, irrelevant, and pending further context. Most of what Craig said at dinner fell cleanly into the second category. That week, however, I found myself paying closer attention than usual. Not because anything he said was surprising, because the absence of surprise had its own particular texture. He didn't ask about my properties. He didn't ask about the trust restructuring that Marshall and I had completed the previous week. He talked about his workplace, his prospects, his director, his contacts, with the comprehensive focus of someone who has built an entire worldview around a single set of coordinates and sees no reason to look beyond them. I watched him do this with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite amusement. Call it professional recognition. He was exactly as I had assessed him to be from the beginning, a man who saw what was in front of him and nothing else. On the 4th day after the letter was dispatched, Craig came home differently. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who did things dramatically when he was rattled, which I had always observed as a kind of tell. When Craig was confident, he was fluid, expansive, occupying whatever room he walked into. When something had gone wrong, he contracted. He became precise and contained in a way that didn't suit him, like a man wearing a coat that was slightly too small and trying not to let it show. He set his briefcase down with particular care. He poured his drink with unusual attention to the pour. He sat in the armchair across from me and looked at the television for approximately 4 minutes without appearing to see it. I turned a page in the book I was reading, a study of early Tennessee land grant disputes that I'd been working through slowly for several weeks. Very useful reference material, as it happened. "Walter," he said finally. "Craig," I said, "I need to ask you something." He turned the glass in his hand. "Do you own the building I work in?" I looked up from the book. I let a beat pass. Not for effect exactly, but because the question deserved a moment of consideration before answering. "I own several commercial properties in the area," I said. "Yes." The glass stopped turning. His face did something interesting. A rapid sequence of calculations passing behind his eyes, each one arriving at an answer he didn't like. "The building on Summit Hill Drive," he said. 840. Harrison Property Trust holds that property, yes. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he put the glass down on the side table with a small, definitive click. Why, he said slowly, did your attorney send a compliance review notice to my director? Today? Without telling me. Because the notice was addressed to Ridgeline Commercial Partners as the tenant, I said. Not to you personally. That's how lease compliance works, Craig. Correspondence goes to the party named in the agreement. You could have said something. About what? I exercise my rights as a property owner. That's not something I need to clear with you in advance. I closed the book. Is there a problem at work? He didn't answer that. He picked up the glass again, finished the drink in one pull, and walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and deliberate, as if he were counting them. Laura came in from the kitchen about 20 minutes later. She had the look she gets when she's heard something she's still processing, a slight tension around the eyes, a controlled quality to her movements. She sat on the edge of the sofa. Dad, she said, Craig told me about the letter. It's a routine compliance notice, I said, standard lease language. He's up for a promotion. I know. She waited for me to say something else. I didn't. She looked at the carpet for a moment. I think this is going to cause problems for him. I think that's between Craig and his employer, Laura. I'm simply managing my property. She left the room without responding. I heard quiet, tense voices upstairs for the better part of an hour. I went back to my chess problem. White's 15th move, the one that opens everything up, had been sitting just beyond my reach for 2 days. I found it that evening. I wrote it in the margin of the problem book in pencil, circled it, and set the book aside. Then I sat in the quiet for a while and thought about a specific thing Craig had said. Why did your attorney send a compliance review notice to my director? Today, without telling me. The phrasing interested me. Not the question itself, but the assumptions embedded in it. He had said, your attorney, which meant he now knew I retained legal counsel for property matters. He had said, without telling me, which meant he believed there was an obligation on my part to consult him before taking standard landlord actions on property I had owned for years before he entered the picture. And he had said today, with the particular emphasis of someone for whom the timing was the injury, separate from the action itself. It was useful information, all of it. I filed it in the appropriate place. The next morning, Craig was gone before I came downstairs. Laura had coffee at the kitchen table with the carefully assembled expression of someone who has decided overnight on a strategy. I recognized the approach. It was the same one she used when she was 11 years old and wanted me to reverse a decision I'd already made. Back then it had worked roughly half the time. The approach was to start calm, build emotional weight gradually, and wait for the moment when the accumulated weight shifted something. She began with a question about how I was feeling. Then she asked about my appointment the previous month. The follow-up I had sat alone in the waiting room for 4 hours. I know that was hard, she said. Craig knows he handled that badly. He apologized, I said. I accepted it. And then you sent a letter to his director. I sent a compliance notice to his company's leasing representative, I said, in my capacity as their landlord. She looked at her coffee. He's not going to get the promotion. I don't know that. He thinks he won't. She looked up. He's angry, Dad. Really angry. I understand. Is that all you have to say? I thought about it for a moment. What would you like me to say, Laura? She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she shifted the conversation, carefully, the way you shift weight on a ladder, toward territory I had been expecting her to reach eventually. If there were some kind of family arrangement around the properties, she suggested, these kinds of situations wouldn't arise. It would all be handled internally, as a family matter. Craig had contacts who could structure it properly. I listened to the complete proposal. Then I said, I'll think about it. She knew what that meant. I could see it in the slight tightening around her eyes when I said it. She'd heard those 3 words before. Craig's attorney reached Marshall Ridley by the end of that week. Marshall called me the following Monday morning. I received a letter, he said, from a Todd Bennett representing Craig Patterson. A pause. He's arguing that your compliance review notice constitutes targeted economic pressure against your son-in-law, potentially actionable under Tennessee business tort law. What's your assessment? I heard the sound of papers. Section 14B is a standard market clause. It appears in commercial leases throughout this region in essentially identical form. It's not personalized, it contains no named individuals, and the triggering condition, reasonable cause to believe conduct has materially compromised the premise's professional reputation, is a threshold that landlords invoke routinely. A brief pause. They're making noise. They don't have a case. Good, I said. Thank you, Marshall. Do you want me to respond to Bennett? Please, professionally. Of course. That evening I made dinner. A simple thing. Chicken and roasted vegetables. The kind of meal I had made on weeknights for many years before the arrangement at Ridgecrest Lane had quietly shifted cooking into Laura's domain. There was something satisfying about standing at the stove in my own kitchen again, with the radio on low and no one else in the room. Craig came home late. He ate quickly, said almost nothing, and went upstairs. Laura sat at the table longer than usual, picking at her food, not watching me. After dinner, I washed the dishes and went to my room. I put a record on, Ahmad Jamal, a late 50s recording, the piano very precise and unhurried. I sat down at the chessboard I kept on the corner table and set up a new position. Not a problem from a book this time, a position of my own construction. I thought about the letter that Todd Bennett had sent Marshall. It was a reasonable move, as these things go, the kind of thing a competent attorney does when a client is backed into a corner and needs to feel like something is being done. File a letter, establish a paper position, give the client the experience of action. The problem, from Craig's side of the board, was that I had structured everything specifically to be invulnerable to that kind of maneuver. The compliance notice was clean. The LLC structure was clean. There was no personal targeting because, legally speaking, there was no personal connection, just a landlord and a tenant, and a clause that had been sitting in the lease since the day it was signed. Craig had worked in that building for 2 years and 7 months without knowing who owned it. That wasn't my oversight, it was his. I moved a night on the board, looked at the resulting position. There was one detail I hadn't shared with Marshall or with anyone else. It wasn't relevant to the compliance notice. It wasn't relevant to the trust restructuring. It was a separate consideration entirely, one I had been turning over quietly in my mind since the evening I first looked at the Summit Hill Drive lease documents, and read, on page 31, section 22, in the event of sale or transfer of the property, landlord's successor shall have the right to renegotiate lease terms with 30 days written notice. I had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to act on that clause in the way I was now considering. I had run the numbers 4 different times to confirm they were correct. I had sat with the idea through 2 Thursday chess evenings, 2 weekend mornings with the record player, 1 full reading of the Ridgeline Commercial Partners lease from page 1 to page 41. The decision had clarified itself gradually, the way decisions do when you stop pushing them and let the logic settle. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the email thread with Rebecca Stone, the real estate agent I had retained through Kingston Pike. A professional referral, nothing more. I found her last message, which referenced the smaller commercial property she was currently marketing for me, the dry cleaning unit valued at $310,000. I typed a new message. Rebecca, change of plans on the current listing? Please put that one on hold. I'd like to discuss a different property, the building at 840 Summit Hill Drive. Call me when you have a moment. I read it over once, made no changes, and pressed send. The clock on the nightstand read 10:40. Ahmad Jamal was playing something I'd always found difficult to name, a standard, reworked so thoroughly it had become almost its own composition. I sat with the chessboard and the music for a while, not moving any pieces. Somewhere above me I could hear Craig pacing. Rebecca Stone called back the morning after I sent her the message about Summit Hill Drive. She didn't express surprise. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her in the weeks since our first meeting at the Kingston Pike office. She processed information quickly and without editorial commentary. I explained what I was considering, a sale of the building at 840 Summit Hill Drive, currently held by Harrison Property Trust, LLC, with active tenants and a lease running to February 2027. I wanted discretion, off-market first, if possible, and I wanted a realistic price, not an optimistic one. Market valuation on a property that size in that corridor, with stable occupancy and a multi-year lease in place, she said. I'd put it 2.1 to 2.2 million. The lease actually works in your favor. A buyer gets immediate cash flow, no vacancy risk. That makes it attractive to investment groups. What kind of timeline are we looking at? If I work my buyer's list first, I can have a qualified conversation started within 3 weeks. Closing would depend on due diligence, typically 60 to 90 days once terms are agreed. I'd like to close before the end of summer, I said. A brief pause. That's manageable. We agreed on terms. She would begin with a small group of regional investors she described as currently active in the Knoxville commercial market. No public listing, no signage, nothing that would appear in any database before a deal was already moving. I thanked her, confirmed the property details, and hung up. I want to be precise about something here, because I think it matters. I did not sell 840 Summit Hill Drive to harm Craig Patterson. I sold it because it was a rational decision about an asset I owned. The compliance review had introduced a degree of professional friction that, in my assessment, made the property less comfortable to hold over the remaining term of the lease. More importantly, I had been considering the sale independently of Craig for some time. The numbers had been sitting in my calculations since the previous spring, and the trust restructuring with Marshall had simply clarified what was already possible. The fact that Craig worked in that building was, legally and structurally, irrelevant to the transaction. I mention this not to construct an excuse, but because precision matters. The difference between what happened and what Craig later claimed happened was the difference between a property owner making a business decision and something else entirely. One of those is what occurred. The documents are clear on the subject. 3 weeks after my call with Rebecca, she phoned me during a Tuesday afternoon while I was cleaning a record, a 1961 Blue Note pressing that had come to me in rough shape and was responding well to careful work. She had a buyer. The group was called Knox Valley Holdings. They were a regional investment partnership that had been acquiring stable commercial assets in East Tennessee for several years, according to the brief profile Rebecca provided. They were not looking for a repositioning project or a value-add play. They wanted what she called a cash-flowing hold, a building with tenants already in place, paying rent under a lease with real time remaining. 840 Summit Hill Drive fit their criteria precisely. Their opening position was $1,980,000. I countered at $2,100,000. We settled after 2 rounds of negotiation conducted entirely through Rebecca at $2,050,000. Closing target, the last day of August. Rebecca's commission at the agreed rate, $41,000. Marshall's fee for legal oversight of the transaction, $8,500. Net proceeds to Harrison Property Trust, after those deductions, just over $2,500,000. I ran the numbers twice and then put the notepad away. There was one element of the sale that I had identified early in the process and had not mentioned to anyone. Not to Rebecca, not to Marshall. It was right there in the lease, on page 31, section 22, in language that was entirely standard and entirely binding. In the event of sale or transfer of the leased premises, landlord's successor shall have the right, upon 30 days' written notice, to renegotiate lease terms, including base rent. Knox Valley Holdings, as it turned out, was the kind of buyer who reads leases carefully. Their attorney flagged Section 22 during due diligence. Their representative, a straightforward woman named Patricia, who communicated by email in clean, brief sentences, raised it in our third exchange. We'd be looking to exercise the renegotiation right on closing. Current market rate for comparable space in that submarket is running about $23,000 to $24,000 monthly. The existing lease is below market. That's your prerogative, I replied. The clause is there. Understood. Just wanted to confirm you had no objection. None at all. 2 weeks before the closing, Ridgeline Commercial Partners received a formal notice from Knox Valley Holdings' attorney. Upon transfer of ownership, the new landlord would exercise its right, under Section 22, to renegotiate the base rent. The proposed new rate was $23,100 per month, effective 60 days after closing. This represented an increase of $4,700 per month, $56,400 per year, above the existing lease rate. I learned about Ridgeline's reaction indirectly through a detail that arrived at Ridgecrest Lane one evening about a week after the notice went out. Craig came home from work with the particular tight-jawed quality he gets when something has happened that he hasn't yet found a way to frame as someone else's fault. He poured his drink. He sat down. He looked at the television for a while without speaking. Then, with the careful casualness of a man pulling a loose thread to see what unravels. "Walter, did you sell a building recently?" "I did," I said. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, not calculation, but something closer to the slow dawning of a comprehension he had been actively resisting. "The Summit Hill building," he said. "Yes." "And the new owners sent a rent increase notice to Ridgeline." "That's between the new owners and their tenants," I said. "It's a standard clause. Section 22. He sat with that for a long moment. I watched the comprehension continue its work behind his eyes, the pieces assembling themselves in sequence, each one landing with what I imagined was a specific and unpleasant weight. The compliance notice, the trust restructuring, the sale, the rent increase, and underneath all of it, the foundational fact that he had lived in my house for 3 years without once asking what I owned. He set the glass down. He looked at me, and for the first time since he had walked into my daughter's life, Craig Patterson said nothing at all. Part 8. The closing on 840 Summit Hill Drive happened on schedule, on the last Friday of August. Marshall and I drove downtown together, a professional arrangement, nothing more, and spent 2.5 hours at a title company on Clinch Avenue, working through the execution of documents that Marshall had reviewed twice in advance, and I had reviewed once. The wire transfer confirmation came through at 11:47 in the morning, $2,050,000 credited to Harrison Property Trust, LLC. I thanked Marshall. We shook hands. I drove home. The house on Ridgecrest Lane was quiet when I arrived. Laura's car was in the driveway. Craig's was not. I went to my room, opened my laptop, and sent Marshall a message with a new set of instructions. I wanted to begin the process of acquiring a condominium at Knox Landing, a development along the Tennessee River that I had been looking at for the better part of a year. 2 bedrooms, river view if available, the building with a full-service lobby and covered parking. Purchase price in the range of $385,000, cash transaction, no financing. Marshall's reply came within the hour. He would contact the listing agent and begin due diligence. The timeline for a cash purchase with no contingencies would be approximately 3 weeks to closing. I went downstairs, made a cup of coffee, and sat on the back porch. Laura found me there about 20 minutes later. She had the look of someone who has been preparing a conversation since morning, composed, measured, but with the faint strain underneath that preparation produces when the subject is something you'd rather not discuss at all. She sat across from me and looked at the yard for a moment. Then, "Dad, are you selling the house?" "No," I said. "I'm moving out. The house isn't changing ownership." She looked at me. "Moving where?" "Knox Landing. I'm purchasing a unit there." The silence that followed was the particular kind that contains a great deal of recalculation. I watched it move across her face, the initial confusion, then the arithmetic of what my leaving actually meant for the arrangement at Ridgecrest Lane, and then something older and quieter underneath all of that, which I chose not to examine too closely because it belonged to both of us and wasn't the subject of the conversation. "When?" she said. "The end of September, most likely, once the paperwork is complete." She nodded slowly. She looked at the yard again. Craig came home that evening later than usual, and with a different energy than the contained frustration mode he had been operating in for the past several weeks. He walked into the kitchen while I was washing the dinner dishes. Laura had eaten early and gone upstairs, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who has decided, finally, to have it out. "I want to talk," he said. "All right," I said. I dried my hands and turned around. He had clearly rehearsed some portion of what followed, and the portion he hadn't rehearsed showed in the places where his argument became less organized. He told me that what I had done, the compliance notice, the sale, The rent increase that was now creating serious operational pressure for Ridgeline was calculated, that I had targeted him specifically, that whatever I thought he had done to deserve it, this was not a proportionate response, and it was affecting not just him, but Laura and their entire future. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I said, "The compliance review was a standard landlord action permitted by the lease you've been working under for 2.5 years. The sale was a business decision about an asset I owned. The rent renegotiation was carried out by the new owners under a clause that was in the lease when Ridgeline signed it. I did not instruct Knox Valley Holdings on their pricing. I have no operational relationship with them. That's not... Craig," I kept my voice level, "I drove you to a hospital for a routine appointment. You told me you'd be back in an hour." I looked at him. "I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. I called you 6 times. I took a taxi home." I paused, just long enough for that to settle. "You apologized the next morning and considered the matter closed." He stared at me. "I'm moving out," I said. "That's my decision, about my life, and I've made it. We don't need to have any other conversation about it." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. His arms were still crossed, but the energy had gone out of the posture. It looked less like confrontation now and more like something a man does when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. Something moved through his expression that I didn't have a name for exactly. Not remorse, not entirely. More like the specific discomfort of a person who has built a careful structure of assumptions and is watching it load bear against weight it wasn't designed to carry. I turned back to the counter. "Craig," I said without looking at him. "I waited 4 hours. From that day forward, I stopped waiting." I heard him leave the room. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, then on the stairs. I heard a door close on the second floor. I dried the last dish. I put it in the cabinet. I turned off the kitchen light and went to my room, where a record was waiting. Chet Baker, a 1954 Pacific jazz pressing that I had been meaning to play for 2 weeks and kept postponing. I set the needle down. I sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the lights were on in the neighborhood. Someone down the street was mowing a late summer lawn. The river was 2 miles from here, and in 3 weeks I would be able to see it from my window every morning. I sat with the music and thought about nothing in particular, which is the closest I come to contentment. Tomorrow Marshall would call with the Knox Landing timeline. Everything was in motion. Everything that needed to be done had been done, cleanly, legally, precisely, without raising my voice once. I thought that was probably enough. I moved out of 1247, Ridgecrest Lane on a Saturday in mid-September. I had arranged a moving company through a service I found online, a small local firm, 2 men with a truck, efficient and professional. I had relatively little to move. Furniture I had acquired in the last few years, the record collection in its climate-controlled shelving, books, personal documents, kitchen items I had been using since before Craig and Laura moved in. I had lived in that house for more than 30 years and had never accumulated much in the way of excess. An archivist learns early that the value of an object has nothing to do with its quantity. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning. Craig had already left for work. Laura stood near the kitchen doorway for part of the morning and watched, saying little. At one point she asked if I needed help with anything. I thanked her and said no. By noon everything was loaded. I did a final walkthrough of the house, not nostalgically, just practically, to confirm nothing had been left behind. The back porch, the bedroom closet, the garage. I stood in the garage for a moment, looking at the empty shelving where the records had been stored. 31 years of evenings and now just clean plywood and the smell of cedar blocks. I drove to Knox Landing in my car, following the moving truck. The new unit was on the 4th floor, a detail that struck me as mildly ironic, given where this story had started. Riverview, 2 bedrooms, a lobby with a doorman whose name was Gerald, and who shook my hand with the straightforward warmth of someone who treats new residents as though they've been there a while. I found that agreeable. The movers were done by 3 in the afternoon. I paid them, tipped them appropriately, and closed the door. I stood in the middle of the main room. The Tennessee River was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and wide in the afternoon light. A barge was moving downstream, unhurried. I unpacked the record player first. That has always been my practice when settling into a new space. The record player first, so the room has something in it before the boxes are unpacked. I found a Billie Holiday pressing near the top of the first crate, a 1958 Columbia recording in very good condition, and put it on. Then I started on the boxes. 2 days after I moved, Laura called. Not the structured, carefully prepared Laura of recent months, the one who had been running arguments and approaches like a project plan. This was a different call. She sounded quieter, a little undone around the edges in a way I hadn't heard since she was much younger. She told me Craig had been let go from Ridgeline. I knew this was coming. After Ridgeline received Knox Valley Holdings' rent renegotiation notice, an increase of $4,700 per month, $56,400 annually, the company had conducted what their internal communication apparently described as a cost structure review. Craig, as an operations manager in a department that was now under pressure to reduce overhead, was one of 4 people who received termination notices. His separation came with 2 weeks of standard severance. He had been at the company for 2 years and 9 months, which put him below the threshold for any enhanced separation package. Laura told me this in a level voice, not accusatory, not asking for anything specific. She seemed more than anything uncertain, as though she was calling because she needed to tell someone and wasn't sure who else to call. "I'm sorry it happened this way," I said, and I was, in the limited sense that applies when an outcome you anticipated still has a human weight to it when it arrives. "Are you?" she said, not bitterly, just asking. I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I'm sorry that you're in a difficult position," I said. "I'm not sorry for the decisions I made. They were mine to make." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He thinks you planned all of it, from the beginning." "I made decisions about property I owned," I said. "The lease terms were in the contract Ridgeline signed. The sale was legal and at market. What their company does with its internal staffing is not something I control." Another silence. "He's not wrong, though, is he?" I didn't answer that directly. "Laura," I said, "I'm going to transfer $15,000 to your personal account, not to a joint account, yours. It's for whatever you need in the next few months, while you figure out what comes next. It's not a loan. It's not conditional." She was quiet for a long time. "Why?" "Because you're my daughter," I said. "That hasn't changed." I transferred the $15,000 the following morning. I confirmed the wire through Marshall's office to ensure it went to her personal account, not to any shared account where Craig could access it. That same week, Rebecca Stone called about a new listing, a small retail strip in a suburb southeast of downtown. 4 units, 3 currently leased to stable long-term tenants. Asking price, $490,000. She had reviewed the financials and thought it was underpriced by roughly $40,000, given current cap rates in the corridor. I drove out to look at it on a Thursday afternoon. Concrete block construction, well-maintained, adequate parking, good visibility from the main road. I walked the perimeter, looked at the roof, noted the condition of the gutters and the HVAC units. I asked Rebecca 3 questions about the tenant leases. She answered them precisely. "I'd like to move forward," I said. That evening I sat at my desk with my notebook and ran the final numbers. The sale of 840 Summit Hill Drive had netted $2,500,000 after commissions and legal fees. The Knox Landing unit had cost $385,000, paid in cash. The new retail strip acquisition would cost $490,000, also cash. After those purchases, the Harrison Property Trust held liquid assets of approximately $972,500 in addition to the remaining properties in the portfolio. The Ridgecrest Lane house, now unoccupied and generating no income, plus 3 other commercial units producing a combined $9,800 per month in rent. I wrote the total portfolio valuation at the bottom of the page, $3,120,000. I looked at that number for a while. Then I closed the notebook. The leaves turned early that year in Knoxville. By the second week of October, the ridge lines east of the city were already running amber and red, visible from my window on clear mornings before the river mist burned off. I had developed a routine at Knox Landing that suited me well. Coffee at the window, the morning paper still in print, which I read in full before doing anything else. Chess at the Gay Street Club on Thursday evenings. I had begun winning more consistently now, which I attributed less to improved skill than to having more uninterrupted time to think. Marshall Ridley sent me the final trust documentation package in early October. The Harrison Property Trust restructuring was complete in every respect. The amended trust instrument, the updated LLC operating agreement, the recorded property transfer documents, the beneficiary designations. Every asset properly held, every document filed, every number confirmed. He included a brief cover letter, professional, a single paragraph, noting that all work had been completed and the file was closed, pending any future transactions I might wish to undertake. I called his office to confirm receipt and to authorize the final billing. His assistant put me through. "Everything in order?" he asked. "Everything in order," I said. "Thank you, Marshall. You did careful work." "That's what I'm paid for," he said, which was the most personal thing he had ever said to me, and I found it entirely satisfying as a professional relationship. I filed the documents in the safe and went back to the window. Laura called twice in October, once early in the month, once about 2 weeks later. The first call was practical. She had found a position at a marketing firm downtown, part-time to start, with the possibility of full-time after a trial period. She sounded cautiously steady, the way people sound when they have made a decision and are committed to it, but haven't yet had the chance to trust it. I told her that was good news. I meant it. The second call was shorter. She told me that she and Craig were filing for divorce. She said it in a direct, factual way, without drama or expectation. I said I was sorry to hear it, which was true in the plain sense that a family dissolving is not something anyone should take satisfaction in. I asked if she had legal counsel. She did, a woman she had found through a colleague at the new job. I told her that was the right thing to have in place. We talked for a few minutes more about nothing in particular, and then said goodbye. I thought about that 14-year-old girl in the library for a while after I hung up, the one speculating about E.L. Briggs and what his life had looked like. She had been curious and unsentimental about the past, even then, interested in the story the object carried, but not burdened by it. I thought that quality was still in her, underneath everything that had accumulated. I hoped so. As for Craig Patterson, I heard through Laura's second call that he had found work at a logistics company on the west side of the city, a management role substantially smaller in scope than his position at Ridgeline. The salary she mentioned, she hadn't offered it, I hadn't asked, it came up incidentally, was $58,000 per year, compared to the $84,000 he had been making before, and considerably short of the $112,000 senior operations manager position that had been removed from consideration in early May. He had not contacted me, I had not contacted him. I want to say something about that, because I think it matters for understanding what any of this was actually about. I did not spend 6 months engineering Craig Patterson's professional decline out of spite or wounded pride or the desire to watch someone suffer. I made a series of decisions about property I owned, under contracts I had every right to exercise, within the legal structure of a state whose laws I understood precisely because I had spent 31 years working with municipal records and had taken the time, after retirement, to understand what I owned and how it was held. The compliance notice was a standard landlord action. The sale was a rational transaction. The trust restructuring was basic estate planning that I should have completed years earlier, regardless of Craig and Laura's presence at Ridgecrest Lane. What Craig experienced was not my punishment of him. It was the natural consequence of building a comfortable life on a foundation you never bothered to examine. He had lived in my house for 3 years. He had worked in my building for 2.5 years. He had looked at me, a quiet, retired archivist with a record collection and a chess habit, and concluded that the space I occupied in his world was roughly equivalent to furniture, present, useful under certain conditions, safely ignored otherwise. That was his error, not mine. I pulled a record from the shelf on a Thursday evening in mid-October, after returning from the chess club. A good evening, 3 games, 2 wins, and a draw I was satisfied with. The record was Frank Sinatra, a 1969 reprise pressing, the My Way album. I had owned it since 1974 and had played it perhaps 100 times in the 50 years since. I set the needle down and sat in the chair by the window. The river was dark and quiet below. A few lights from the far bank reflected on the water in long, broken lines. I thought about a waiting room with plastic orange chairs and a television running too low to hear. I thought about a phone that rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I thought about a taxi ride through East Tennessee in April, watching the hills go past and the specific quality of the silence in that cab when I stopped thinking about the offense and started thinking about numbers. A man can sit in a waiting room and feel small, or he can sit in a waiting room and decide, quietly and without announcement, that he is done waiting. I had chosen the second option. I had not raised my voice once in 6 months. I had not made a single threat, filed a single complaint, or said a single word to anyone at Ridgeline Commercial Partners. I had simply done what I had every right to do: reviewed a lease, restructured a trust, sold a building, bought a condominium, and allowed the logic of well-prepared documents to do what logic does when given sufficient space to operate. The record was playing the final track, Sinatra, unhurried and precise, in a room that was his. I sat with that for a while. The river moved. The lights held their shapes on the water. I picked up the green notebook from the desk and looked at the last entry. The portfolio total, $3,120,000, written in the careful hand I had developed in 31 years of keeping accurate records. I closed the notebook. I put it in the desk drawer. Then I leaned back in the chair, looked at the dark river, and smiled. Not triumphantly, not with bitterness or relief, simply the way a man smiles when he has handled his own affairs with precision, when the documents are filed and the numbers are correct, and the record is playing and the chair by the window faces the right direction. It was, all things considered, a good place to be. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.